So good evening, everyone. My name is Awais Siddique. I'm the research analyst at the Center of Pakistan International Relations, and I will be the moderator of our today's session. So I welcome everyone on this webinar of Center of Pakistan International Relations. It is focused on hybrid warfare, the changing dynamics of conflict, war, and national security. So a brief about Center of Pakistan International Relations. It is a strategic think tank building a positive narrative of Pakistan at national and international levels. COPER initiates and advocates policies of national development in order to build a sustainable, inclusive, and resilient Pakistan. Our center aims to act as a platform for the engagement of foreign and local speakers and intelligentsia to discuss various national, global, and international issues and provide policy recommendations. Center of Pakistan International Relations is dedicated to the study of defense, security, and strategic studies, and it seeks to promote an in-depth analysis of national and international affairs, especially the one which thrives on the intersection of policy formulation and policy making. Moving onwards, next slide, please. I would like to introduce our team to you. Our The president of Center of Pakistan International Relations is Ms. Amna Malik. Then we have Khalid Latif, who's an advisor on international affairs. Then we have Mushahid Hussain, who is the research associate. Next slide, please. The We have a distinguished board of advisors, Dr. Zafar Nawaz Jaspal, who is the senior advisor on national security and foreign policy. Then we have General Retired Nasser Janjua, who is the former national security advisor of Pakistan and currently advising COPER on national security issues. Then we have Ambassador Khalid Mahmood with us and Hassan Dawood, who's the senior advisor on the development. So moving onwards, the agenda of today's webinar will be first, the president of Center of Pakistan International Relations will deliver her preliminary remarks. Then we have Brian L. Steed from the Command and Staff College, USA, who will be talking about narrative warfare and its relevance to the hybrid warfare. Then we have Ala Al-Aridi, who's the international law expert, and he will be talking about the hybrid warfare, especially the cyber attacks and non-state groups under the Jus ad Bellum and Jus in Bello. Then we have Dr. Masood Khattak with us from Pakistan. He will be talking about the Indian hybrid warfare strategy and challenges for the Pakistan. And finally, we will have Ofer Friedman with us, who will shed light on the conceptual understanding of the hybrid warfare. Next slide, please. So starting from, this is something I borrowed from Dr. Frank Hoffman's content, in which he asked that the very question of what is war. So in order to understand the hybrid warfare, first we have to understand that what is war. And to move onwards, there is a central challenge confronting the international relations today, that we do not know what really war is and what is not. So next slide, please. Then I'll be quoting Frank Hoffman again, because he's the proponent of hybrid warfare, and he coined the term. As he says that hybrid warfare is something which goes beyond a blend of regular and irregular tactics. So to further clarify, he says that it is a threat by an adversary that simultaneously and adaptively employs a fused mix of conventional weapons, irregular tactics, catastrophic terrorism, and criminal behavior in the battlefield to obtain desired political objectives. It is a fusion of advanced military capabilities with irregular forces or tactics, and this type of attack has appeared in the past repeatedly, like the case of Lebanon, where Hezbollah was claimed to be using hybrid threats. In Georgia and Ukraine, Russia was claimed to have hybrid threats, the proponent of hybrid threats. And then in Pakistan, we are also facing gray zone challenges or hybrid threats from our eastern neighbor, India. So as Frank Hoffman told, that we fail to realize that the war is a socio-political construct varied by strategic culture. It can take many forms, as the definition of hybrid warfare by NATO suggests, that basically hybrid warfare is a term. It's a basket where different things, they come into it, and it contains lawfare, diplomatic maneuvering, social and economic disruption, conventional warfare, irregular warfare, asymmetric tactics. So moving onwards, next slide, please. Uh, the, the scope of hybrid warfare is that, as I already mentioned, that it contains a lot of things. Next slide, please. Uh, the next thing is that the evolution of the term of the hybrid warfare itself. Um, uh, in the hybrid warfare is something which prevailed over centuries, but the term came into academia in the 21st century when it was used in 2002 first time by William J. Nemeth in the Future War and Chechnya, a case of hybrid warfare, a paper written by him. Then the same anecdote was picked up by Frank Hoffman, where he called it a multimodal activity. Then in 2015, the role of social media and internet get into it, and it was labeled as a force multiplier and as a hybrid threat. In 2016, the term took a further step, and it was extended by Alexandra Lenzowska, who have written a paper on Russian hybrid warfare and extended deterrence in the Eastern Europe. Next slide, please. So the purpose of hybrid warfare, as we know, it ranges from distraction to lowering morale of an adversary, disruption in societal economic spheres, countering the enemy diplomatically, initiating a political or economic chaos. And it has been done by several means, like especially in the 21st century when there's an advancement in the technology and and due to the expansive use of technology by civilians, such as cyberspace, social media, artificial intelligence, even now the data mining, the lines are between conventional and hybrid warfare are blurring. And this will be the focus of our today's session. Pakistan, in the case of Pakistan, although Pakistan is, equipped with all the elements of credible deterrence in the conventional realm, but in the hybrid or gray zone conflicts, the security operators of the country is still vulnerable, and we have seen several such threats coming from our eastern border. And this is why the country has been suffering from insurgencies, from the separatist movements in Balochistan and Fata region. The country has been diplomatically cornered in the case of Kashmir through false flag operations and labeled as a terrorist country through fake news and stimulated narratives backed by India. Media manipulation is a decisive instrument of prevalent hybrid warfare and psychological warfare, and it has been employed in Pakistan by its adversaries. There is the case of fake or hoax news network sites, which were debunked by EU Disinfo Lab last year. There were more than 250 news sites circulating fake news about Pakistan in more than 60 countries. So our adversary tends to exploit the ethnic, the cultural, the regional divide within the country, and sponsoring this, and it is sponsoring the separatist and insurgent elements in the country. So to overcome this lopsided threat and ensuring credible deterrence against hybrid threats, all elements of Pakistan national security community must assess and prepare for the complete array of challenges we are facing in today's dynamic world. Uh, for this purpose, next slide, please. For this purpose, COPER aims to organize a webinar where multidimensional challenges of hybrid warfare will be discussed and recommendations will be laid forth by the panelists to overcome these non-conventional challenges. Now, as you can see, the Pakistan's gray zone challenges, they comprise of insurgencies and separatist movements. There are false flag operations. There's diplomatic maneuvering. There's a issue of fake news, and most importantly, there's a problem of psychological warfare or narrative warfare. Next slide, please. So, as Frank Hoffman, I'm repeating him again, but he's an authority on the subject. As he said, that hybrid wars blend the lethality of the state conflict with the fanatical and protracted fervor of irregular warfare. Next slide, please. So moving on towards the objectives of our today's webinar, we are here to understand the conceptual foundations and implications of hybrid warfare for defense forces and national security architecture. We are here to recognize the prevalent threats and challenges of hybrid warfare, especially in South Asia and particularly in Pakistan, and identify the vulnerabilities of the country's security operatives then we will reconsider the strategies, the capacities, and the capability of armed forces to counter these threats. Then we will also like our panelists to highlight the multifaceted challenges of hybrid warfare, particularly in case of Pakistan, and assess the solutions adopted by the defense establishment of the country to deter these asymmetric threats. We would also like them to broaden our vision of not only the military modernization campaign of any country, but also, to hint and to indicate the direction towards exploring new types of warfare and deterrence. And then finally, we are here to gather their insights and to spot the new trends, and they will obviously provide recommendations for the policy making related to the national security. So next slide, please. That's all. Then now I would like to begin the session by inviting our first panelist. It's Brian Elstede. He is the associate professor of at U.S. Command and General Staff College, USA. He's a strategic security consultant with more than 13 years of experience assisting senior level US and foreign leaders. He is an applied historian with 7 of the 8 books focused on using historical analysis to inform current and future decisions. He's a cross-culture specialist with more than 8.5 years of experience in living abroad, and 4.5 of those years serving in closely with the foreign ministries. He's a military theorist who originated concepts for the cross-cultural competency for conceptualizing current conflict environment. He's a thinker and a communicator who originates solutions to the complex problems and communicate those solutions so that they are easily understandable to a layperson. So he will be talking about the narrative warfare and its relevance with the hybrid warfare. Let's all welcome him today. Welcome on board, sir. The stage is yours now.
I'm glad we began with a quote from Frank Hoffman, because he is presenting, I think, what is a very Western European and American interpretation of hybrid warfare. I hopefully will present a slightly different version of what I think it means and how it operates, or how I think we need to understand it and operate with it. So first, I'm kind of required to say that I am not talking today as a representative of the United States government or the United States Army Command and General Staff College. So I'm just giving my thoughts and my opinions. So yesterday, though, I was having a conversation sort of in preparation for this about what is hybrid warfare. And what I find fascinating is that we treat this like it's a new thing. Hybrid warfare has always been a thing. It is, in essence, when a force identifies somebody else's superiority and capability, they're not going to try to compete. So, as I know, almost everybody on this probably does not understand American football. But in the American football world, we have the Super Bowl in 4 days, or anyway, this coming Sunday. And so if you look at this from a sports perspective, regardless of the sport you're playing, if somebody is going to go against the best American football team in the world, and they don't have to play football, why would they play American football? It's just an obvious thing. If I need to beat the best team in the world, why would I do or go against them at that thing that they do best? So anything that tries to approach an opponent using other capabilities other than what they do well can be considered hybrid warfare. So I think that's the first thing that we have to realize. This has been going on for a long time. If you fought the Romans 2,000 years ago, you probably would not want to go heavy infantry against heavy infantry. So you figured out some other way to approach it. To a degree, war studies, I think, have been skewed by a European experience for hundreds of years of European history, where essentially states did go against states in a relatively, and I want to emphasize relatively, symmetrical way. And that, I think, causes many of us to consider that war is, in fact, typically symmetrical, and it is not. I think historically that has not been the case, and we need to recognize that the European experience from whatever period we want to say, 1500 to 1945, is an atypical experience once we go outside of Europe and we go outside of that period. All that said, what do I think matters now? So the best example, I think, of this change and what I think is hybridity comes from ISIS, and particularly the battles of Mosul. So I want to use an example of the Battle of Mosul and compare it from 2014, when ISIS captured the city, to 2016 and 2017, when the Iraqi security forces, with coalition firepower support, retook the city. And one of the things that's important to recognize anytime we talk about ISIS, every single number is open for debate and question. I personally think we're never going to know the real numbers associated with how many people fought and how many people died. So these are sort of best guesstimates based off of reporting, and also trying to communicate just how different these two attacks were. So in 2014, ISIS takes the city in 6 days. It takes the Iraqi security forces 278 days to retake the city. ISIS takes this with somewhere around 1,000 forces. It's debatable how many were defending, but the numbers go up to as many as 60,000. This is a ratio that is unheard of in military history, that a 1 to 60 ratio in a heavily urbanized area. So, and when we understand in part why this happened, well, it gets, understanding why this happened helps inform this radical difference. If we look at the kinetic side, this 2016 to 2017, the numbers, the ratios are what we would expect. It's what we sort of teach officers in our professional military education institutions to expect, that if you're attacking into a densely urban area, you need to have about 12 to 1 advantage. You need to have, so these are relatively reasonable numbers on the right side, but the left side gets at just how radical the ISIS environment was. And my contention is ISIS attacked with a narrative-led environment that began with 4 years, well, I say began with, but there was at least 4 years of preparation that preceded their attack in June 2014. Now, when many people see that number and then look at the 278 days, we'll think, wow, ISIS had a massive advantage. That's a huge difference. But it is important to remember that the Iraqi security forces and the coalition with them had something like 2.5 years of preparation before they started to retake Mosul as well. So it isn't like one had a lot of preparation and one had none. They both prepared for years to do this battle. And we get at what makes the difference. So, you can highlight the massive differences. One of the things I think that is critical is ISIS was able to take the city by doing relatively little damage or destruction to the city, whereas when the Iraqi security forces retook the city, it was massive damage and destruction to it. Well, what did they do? So I actually began my academic career as a geology student. So I'm going to use a geologic metaphor. And for those of you wondering how I became a historian, it's because of chemistry. So that's why. Anyway, so here you have this idea that you have a enduring narratives and transient narratives. But one of the things I want to emphasize as we talk about this is there is generally a societal narrative with almost every society. It is probably not a monolithic narrative. I've written recently and talked quite a bit about how in America there are multiple narratives. I'm sure that is true in whether talking about Pakistan or almost any other country in the world. Certainly ones that are multi-ethnic, large populations, you can expect that there are multiple societal narratives. But in general, there's probably one dominant societal narrative. So what did ISIS do to be successful? One, they understood the societal narrative of Iraq and what was going on, particularly of Sunni Iraq. And once again, with respect to Mosul, specifically for Mosul, and how people understood that connection and what it is their society sort of required, what their aspirations were, and what they should expect from their government. That all goes into the societal narrative. What ISIS also did is they understood the governing story. So every government has a story for how they are going to meet the societal narrative, whether that's a story of how they're going to provide resources or they're going to provide opportunities. Every governing entity has such a story for how they do that. But no government is perfect at doing that. So there's always some dissonance between the societal narrative and the governing story, or a gap that exists. That's always true 100% of the time for every country anywhere. So what does a group like ISIS need to do? Well, one, they need to expand that gap, grow that distance, and then they need to try to place their story in between the governing story and the societal narrative. So in effect, what they're saying is our story, the ISIS story, is going to be more effective for you, the people, in answering what you believe you need, what your societal narrative tells you is important. And as well, at the same time, so they want to increase the resonance of their story at the same time as increasing the dissonance of the governing story. And ideally, increase that dissonance to such a degree that they displace it. Now, this literally happens in Mosul, that ISIS, within just a matter of days of attacking, and even before the attack, when you study the stories of what happened in Mosul, a lot of security forces were fleeing the area or simply not reporting to work out of fear because of social media posts or concerns of things that were happening outside of Mosul, so that when the battle begins in Mosul, ISIS is not fighting a determined Iraqi security force. They're fighting a weakened Iraqi security force that is not interested in fighting in many cases. And those who were interested in fighting now were much more closer in parity in terms of numbers to the ISIS fighters. So ISIS did not go in fighting one ISIS versus 60 Iraqi security forces. Because of their narrative success, they literally caused to leave Mosul tens of thousands of Iraqi security force personnel. That is tremendous narrative success. And then, of course, you have, the aftermath of what occurs, which is a horrific destruction when Mosul's regained. One of the things I want to emphasize when we talk about how this all works is, so the way I think hybrid warfare is going to play is it's a hybridity not of technologies, not of, or not necessarily just of technologies or of techniques, but it's a hybridity of philosophies, philosophical approaches to war, that it's not just about the kinetic or the violence. It's also about this narrative ability. Some of the other speakers today, just based off of topics, not based off of speaking to them, I think are going to address ways that people or opponents are going to fight and affect human cognition. So cyber is a way to affect the cognitive aspects of how people make decisions and how you actually influence, whether you can influence through social media or you can influence through the internet or traditional media broadcasts or newspapers. So that influence, for that influence to be successful, it is necessary that somebody understands the societal narrative, they understand the governing story, they understand the dissonance between the governing story and that societal narrative, and then a successful player like ISIS was in Mosul in 2014 will be able to expand that dissonance. Now, a group like ISIS did this for, as I said previously, for years. And they did it through a variety of techniques, some very violent. So this isn't that they don't use violence, but they're using violence within a narrative construct. So that's what they're hybridizing, is this understanding of narrative and how to manipulate it, along with this use of violence, so that the violence is targeted and effective to influence or generate the influence they need, so that they will ultimately displace the governance and then be able to replace that governance with their own governing authority. And I think it's an intriguing and important aspect as we appreciate how this works. And it's not simply, I mean, ISIS is, I think, a really great and clear example, because they've done so much with media, they've done so much with internet, with videos, that we can see how they communicated and we can understand these details. And especially because they are such, in terms of numbers, in terms of how we would determine military power, they are a very weak actor. And they fought against a security force that had been trained by the United States, that had been equipped by the United States for more than 8 years. And then they defied the Iraqi security forces, along with a coalition of dozens of nations, for years. So you see this extreme of a weak actor defying, arguably, in some ways anyway, one of a very powerful coalition of forces. And they're able to do it. And in part, the argument here is they're able to do it because of their appreciation of narrative. So for us to either protect ourselves or to function in this world, we're going to have to go through the same levels of understanding. Do we understand our own, excuse me, do we understand our own narratives and how those play out publicly, and how the governing stories connect with the people, and with whom do they connect? This is a fascinating place. Obviously, and I don't know how well it's played globally, but America has recently had a presidential election. And it's been a fascinating time to observe within America that there are, in fact, competing narratives. One of the contentions I've made is that for most of American political history, we've typically had one dominant narrative that each political party tried to provide their story for how to answer the societal narrative. But the last two presidential campaigns in America have demonstrated that each political party is actually providing a story to answer a different narrative demand. And that's part of what's generating the cognitive dissonance that you see within America, in terms of whether or not election results are legitimate, whether or not election results should be accepted. And I would suggest that this happens in most countries where there is election frustration. So if there's election frustration, it's probably because there are multiple narratives that exist, and the different candidates or parties are presenting different stories to solve for the different narratives. And this is why people from another narrative cannot understand the solution. So 4 years ago, Democrats in America could not understand how Donald Trump's story solved for the dissonance in America. And in 2020 and into 2021, supporters of Donald Trump do not understand how Joe Biden's story has solved for the dissonance with the societal narrative, in part because these are two different stories, or rather, correction, two different narratives that are being solved for. So to prevent or to protect a country against somebody who's trying to do what ISIS did, it's critical that people are aware of what are the competing narratives within their country, and where the dissonance exists within their own countries between what their governing story is and their societal narrative. And I will end with that. I certainly invite people to reach out. I'm going to have to leave this discussion much earlier than I would like, but I have a variety of connections to include a website where I really invite discussion on these topics, because I think narrative is how groups like ISIS and others, and it's not just non-state actors. I think the Russian government, the Chinese government are operating in the same sort of narrative space approach as well. And so it is important for us to understand this aspect of conflict as much as it is to understand the kinetic, violent side of conflict. So thank you very much. And I look forward to any questions that come.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bryan, for your wonderful speech and enlightening us about the narrative warfare and how it's related to the hybrid warfare. President Ms. Amna Malik, she thanked you for your wonderful presentation. And she had a question that for a country like Pakistan, how government can, especially in the sense of the narrative warfare which Pakistan is in, and how to develop a positive image of Pakistan. So you already told us about the multiple layers of narratives. Can you just relate it with the case of Pakistan?
That is, so I have not had the fortune of visiting Pakistan. I have lived in the Middle East quite a bit, so I cannot speak to the details of all of the varieties of narratives in Pakistan.
Let me give you just a brief. It's a country located in South Asia. We are a developing country. We suffered from the war on terror, which was actually in Afghanistan, and we had its blowback on Pakistan. Pakistan is currently, there's a narrative prevailing in the in the international world that Pakistan it's a safe haven for terrorism, although it wasn't. It was always affected by it was affected from the blowback of the terrorism in Afghanistan. But Pakistan is not a country like the narrative which is prevailing internationally. So what do you suggest that what should be the policy of the government to portray its true image? I should not use the word that a softer image or a positive image. How should the government, portray its true image to the world? What should be the policy for this, according to you?
Okay, well, I think first and foremost, it's I don't think it's necessarily portraying it to the world as much as it's understanding itself. Pakistan, because one of the things I wanted to continue with, like what I do understand of Pakistan is there are multiple narratives that exist within Pakistan. And when I say narratives, it's not just, different stories or different ethnic groups. Like there are different ways of viewing, interpreting the world. So I work with Narrative Strategies, Dr. Ajit Maan, and she talks quite a bit about the differences between narrative and story and what narratives are. And it is a way to process information and to determine what is true and what is reality, or how to interpret facts and data. So when events happen, how does one perceive that? And it is in a country as diverse as Pakistan, there is no one way that all the people are perceiving what is going on. So one of the challenges in Pakistan, much as is true as I described for America, is appreciating the differences and understanding what those different narratives are and where the dissonance exists between what the government is saying as a story for how they're going to solve for the challenges that Pakistan faces versus what the people are demanding. And obviously, you also have differences in terms of different regions and different ethnicities, and even to a degree, different languages that exist. So all of these are challenges. And I think part of the same thing is recognizing Pakistan's role in the world. So Pakistan as a contributor to the global war on terrorism, it has, and particularly for whatever happens in Afghanistan, is a tremendously important country. And expressing how Pakistan is a player in that, plays a positive role, is also a critical portion. But so much of this is recognizing what is the existing narrative and what is the story that the government is using, and where is there a dissonance between that. So I don't want to take everybody else's time, but I think that it sounds simple. Like, I mean, I can say it and, oh, this is an easy thing, understand this and understand this, but this is a complex process that a great many people, once again, I use America because I'm living here right now and I'm quite familiar with it. Very few American leaders recognize the differences, and quite often the way they portray somebody who believes differently than they do is as if that person is disingenuous or that person is being manipulative. They don't respect that other view is as legitimate a view and perspective as their own. And that's a critical portion to actually getting to resolving disputes within a country. And obviously that is a necessary component for reducing civil strife and opportunities for civil strife by other actors. I hope that answers at least some of what your question.
You almost got it. So to conclude the answer that you gave, in a one word, can you say that you say for there's a need of inclusivity. There's a need for adopting multiple narratives.
There is certainly a need for recognizing, solving for multiple narratives, solving for the multiple dissonances, if you will. It would be nice if every country could have one narrative, because it just makes it easier. But the reality is certainly large and diverse countries are probably never going to have a single narrative. So you have to recognize the variety, and then you have to be able to solve for that variety, which once again is a tremendously difficult political problem. This is not simple at all. But part of I would say the root of the problem is most people don't even recognize that. They just think that the other side, that other perspective is radical or harmful. They don't see it as legitimate.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Brian. If anyone else have a question from the panel. Yeah, so that's all from Mr. Brian. Thank you very much for your time, for your wonderful presentation. Someone also asked for your slides, and I suggest that with the consent of Mr. Brian, we will upload this video on the YouTube, and you can always watch that later on. Thank you very much. Moving on towards our next speaker of today's session, it's Mr. Ala Al-Aridi. He's an international law specialist and a PhD researcher at Vilnius University, Lithuania. Being associated with the Public International Law Department at Vilnius University, he focuses on modern armed conflicts, international humanitarian law, human rights, and cybersecurity. So he achieved his LLM, International and European Union Law, and master's degree in International Maritime Law. And he's currently member of BACC and the former legal assistant at International Arbitration Law firm. Today, he will be talking about hybrid warfare, especially the cyber attacks and non-state armed groups under Jus Bellum and Jus in Bello. So the stage is yours, Mr. Aridi. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Mr. Sadiq. It's definitely a pleasure to be part of this conference. So good afternoon from Lithuania. Good morning to our participants. Good evening, and to everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, the speakers, and the audience for this excellent virtual conference in a time that we are all struggling to cope with the pandemic, which actually changed the way we live. But of course, here comes the advantages of the technology in connecting us to discuss and share our expertise in different fields in a world, unfortunately, is also full with challenges. Nonetheless, humans have always proved their resilience in facing adversity through cooperation, collaboration, and ability to handle any kind of a threat. Why I started with this introduction, the answer is simple. Because hybrid warfare, in my opinion, is also a threat that emerged and evolved throughout history. And here I also agree with Mr. Steed about that it's nothing new. And now it's our turn to work on tackling its complex nature for what best serves the international peace and security, and of course for the safeguard of our survival as humans. Allow me first of all to start with that hybridity of current armed conflict, let me say, as we international lawyers prefer to call, is highly relevant and important for policymakers, for legal scholars, for state, non-state actors, and also for humanitarians. When I was asked a couple of years ago to conduct research on this topic, first thing came to my mind was, what is hybrid warfare? What is new about it? And does it really challenge the applicable laws? After some time, my answer to this question actually came more hybrid. And I will try in this short presentation to explain why. Of course, I tried to limit the presentation to talk about certain characters of hybrid warfare, such as cyber operations, non-state actors. But as mentioned before, there are plenty of means and methods used during these kind of threats or warfare, because every country and every state look at it from different aspects. What exactly they've been facing, what are the means that they had to encounter during a conflict or not. So when defining a hybrid warfare as a form of war in terms of the legal complexities that adversaries tend to craft, it will require a different interpretation than the ones examined in military manuals and at political level. Nevertheless, there's always common ground. So when we look at the legality to use force in international relations, or what's so-called jus ad bellum, for those who are not familiar with this term, under peacetime regime. And also when we look at the applicable principles and rules that are designed to limit the use of violence during wartime, or what is so-called jus in bello, or international humanitarian law. So these are two things we as international lawyers look at them, because that's why when we talk about cybersecurity, cyber operations, or non-state actors, because these operations reach the level of attack, of armed conflict, they are able to create some kind of physical damage and others. And I will try also to analyze this during the presentation. Firstly, if we look at the evolving nature of wars and its methods, we can trace it back hundreds of years ago. And we see the strategies which is used, for example, from Sun Tzu's strategy, considering that supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemies resistant without fighting. Then we go to von Clausewitz, which is more Western way, who considered that the backbone of surprise is fusing speed with secrecy. After that, wars and conflicts also evolved, and the new terms were introduced, such as the war on terror and its extraterritorial effect, to Frank Hoffman's, which you mentioned, of course, hybrid warfare concept in the aftermath of the war in South Lebanon in 2006, which highlighted at that period also Hezbollah's capability as a hybrid non-state actor that could actually face a state. To the conflict in Ukraine and Syria, and to and its coexisting nature. For example, we see that we have international armed conflict, non-international armed conflict in a single battlefield. All these actually create some kind of confusion. Then we talk about cyber operations such as Stuxnet, such as attacks on Estonia and the series of cyber attacks like WannaCry ransomware and others. Also, there are so many debates and discussions about military operations in space now and how it will be regulated. So this is what's going on in the international field with regards to these new means and methods. So these series are actually series of events that shared hybrid characteristics. So this answers my second question. Hybrid warfare is not new, but it creates new challenges to the legal order due to the complex nature of new technologies and its interconnectivity. Also, the role of non-state actors and their ability to occupy territories to create international network that made them well organized and can conduct operations at level of intensity that states before had monopoly. So hybrid wars then falls short from all traditional classification of conflicts. And rather it combines their distinct features in a single form. We all know this, but that creates a legal gray area. But that doesn't mean that we are in a legal vacuum. It doesn't fall in a legal vacuum. So when we consider that hybrid warfare is changing the nature of conflicts, we might be overreacting. Rather, I would say it is showing us that old and new challenges are now combined and adding to it new opportunities which are offered by the technology, which in fact raises concerns that requires the international community to address them. So it's our time now as an international community, as states, as NGOs, to look at these concepts. For example, one of the central features of hybrid warfare, which we know, which is also not new, is deniability and tendency to avoid attribution. So that finds refuge in the employment of the non-state armed groups, such as whether proxy or whether private contractors. Also, it finds refuge in offensive cyber operation and also the instrumentalization of laws, or what's so-called lawfare, which is basically the use and misuse of law as a weapon. So these are all different factors. I'm sorry, I'm putting them all together now, but that's hybridity, to be honest. But in fact, as I said, this is not new. International laws are always challenged by new means and methods. And the reason why certain rules, for example, especially if we look at the Geneva Conventions and its additional protocols, were broad in nature, structured to include future threats accompanied by role of international courts and state practice to interpret them. So there's all the time a way that any kind of new methods and means will be actually addressed in these international laws, but in practice it would be more difficult. But what concerns us here is the rapid development of these weapons and methods that are allowing states to justify also certain actions legally unjustified, such as, for example, targeted killings, global battlefields, interventions without the consent of the territorial state, and many other questions which are legally addressed and now are very important in current conflicts. Such justifications and constant practice might lead into a customary international law or rule in the future. We've seen that. We've seen, for example, when self-defense used to be with regards to an attack, then it improved to be more that also when there is some kind of threat. So a state might see that there is some kind of a threat coming in the future. So we can use self-defense in that. That's now more a custom used in practice. On the other hand, the legal development of the term armed conflict that replaced the term war is now used to describe violence between states and violence between states. And it is actually the reflection of the changing of character of these conflicts. So armed conflicts now are described kind of violence between states and between states and non-state actors, also between non-state actors within a territory, whether there is a declaration of war or not, whether there is state admitted its involvement in conflict or not. So now we're looking more based on facts, on a threshold of violence, of parties to a conflict. Who are these parties? Similarly, when we look at the United Nations Charter that has set kind of threshold of what constitute as use of force in international law, international relations, starting from the general prohibition under Article 2.4 of the United Charter, and also the exceptions which are limited to certain cases such as self-defense or the authorization of Security Council to use collective self-defense. All these have been there and actually are capable of looking at the cases of hybridity. However, for laws to prevail, it requires clear identification of who is conducting these operations, who are the parties to the conflict, what is an attack in cyberspace, for example, what about also state responsibility for unlawful acts conducted by hackers, cyber militias, or organized groups. These are actually very hard questions now, which you should look at them and study them based case-by-case study. So let us, I would like to ask you, Mr. Sadiq, whenever I come close to the time, please let me know if I'm, but I think I can make it within 20 minutes. So I will give some examples. For example, operations against non-state actors. Who are those actors and how to identify their status? And what about the relation to foreign powers? How you can make this link between them. Here comes to the role of attribution. That is a key element in hybrid strategy. For example, for instance, Article 3 of the Geneva Convention, of the Fourth Geneva Convention, asserted that a belligerent party shall be responsible for all the acts committed by persons performing part of its armed force. This question, then how then to attribute the actions of these groups to a state, or if there is. Of course, we can refer here to control tests, such as the effective control test, which was introduced by the ICJ in the Nicaragua case. So when the person are being directed or controlled by a third state. Then we look at the other control test, which is the overall control that goes beyond the mere financing of armed groups and also involves a state in its participation for planning and supervision of military operation. But in our view, mainly during my research also, I always find that even hybrid adversaries are capable of making these two tests inadequate, especially with the new technologies and tactics. Take an example, for example, maritime militias, such as the Chinese Haishang Minbing, that are fishermen and military group once needed. So they can directly change their status based on what is the situation. Similarly, the Little Green Men in Ukraine and their role in contributing to foreign powers' success in the conflict. And of course, Mr. Friedman will analyze more in that. He's more specialized in this topic. But in this case, it is hard for victim state to make a link in a timely manner. So it would be late. So if we see what happened in Ukraine, that at the beginning, Russia at that period was considering that the Little Green Men, or these are actually kind of local militias. They are defending themselves, and after that, after a while, when they took control, they considered them part of the Russian troops. So it's in a way, it shows that it grows gradually till the strategy or what is needed from this operation succeeds. So this uncertainty requires rapid steps by developing a clear policy and doctrine to bridge over any gap that hybrid warfare successfully exploits through means of politicizing the law and the legal arguments. On the other side, under the law of armed conflict, the law that applies once a conflict occurs. This is very important also with the new technologies. We've seen this problem also with the conflict between Russia and Georgia. There were a series of cyber attacks before actual physical or troops on ground of the Russian troops in Georgia. We've seen that the attack started way before, not way before, but a couple of weeks or months before, which had real impact on the operations. Yet the international humanitarian law was applicable only when the troops intervened. But this actually also is arguable. We'll not go through this, but it's one of the points that should be considered, that the IHL applies from the moment that the cyber attacks started and had their impact, whether physical or not. For example, when we go back to the law of armed conflicts, or IHL, the classification of international armed conflict between states or in case of occupation, and other side is the non-international armed conflict that usually occurs between governmental forces and non-state actors or between each other. So how would it be in a hybrid scenario? Other issues raised also by what's so-called the spillover conflict. So when a non-international armed conflict is occurring in a territory, but actually it spills, it goes to a neighboring country. While it is agreed that international community that it does not change the nature of the conflict of no other state involved. So if the neighboring country did not have any conflict, direct conflict or direct confrontation with the victim state, then it would stay in non-international armed conflict, but also this is debatable. For example, to what extent can IHL apply in transnational conflicts? Does it allow the victim state to extend the non-international armed conflict to the whole territory of another state or not? Or would that be considered as an intervention? This is also will be assessed on case-by-case study, such as the position of neighboring states, and we look at the scale of operation and other factors. So there are many things which also are still debatable. But if you ask me what I would say about this, my answer will be is to limit such expansion to neighboring territories with the consent of the territorial state. Because if we don't have the consent of the territorial state, even though there are so many the unable or unwilling new way of justifying also interfering in another states, but also you see that they always look at means to or ways to get the consent of that other state. So it's always important that we focus on this particular point. Similarly, additional challenges rise from the cyber attacks that target a party in a conflict from the territory of another state. So, and this is very, very obvious. So there are views of expanding the conflict to cover the territory from which the attack was launched. But that has the risk of what's so-called global battlefield, especially that cyber attacks can be launched from anywhere. So if you're gonna chase a cyber hacktivist or a cyber group, they can launch attacks from everywhere, and directing at or responding back to this have critical can create more problems. So it is similar to the problem of targeting killing and the war on terror, but on a larger scale. One of the recommendations is what's so-called the development of due diligence rule in cyberspace that can apply in both jus ad bellum and jus in bello. What does it mean? This rule actually is widely accepted in the field of prevention of transboundary harm in international environmental law. It is very important for attack generated from the territory of another state, though it requires two criteria, which we find also hard to fulfill, such as knowledge and harm threshold. So a state must have actual knowledge that the harm to be responsible for applying due diligence to prevent transboundary operations. For example, if an armed group, whether proxy or anonymous from state A, are using the territory of state B to conduct cyber attacks against the computer system in state C. So we have three different countries involved, territories involved, which is often an ordinary scenario in conflicts, in nowadays conflicts. So in this case, the Tallinn manual, which is made from group of experts, and I started because I hold it everywhere. It's like, for me, very important. This has so many answers to the legal complexities of cyberspace. So the Tallinn manual conducted that the diligence obligation attached to a state through which data only transits, for example, a fiber optic cable located within a state, but conceded that the transit state responsibility is unlikely to be carried out in practice in comparison with a state in which specific cyber infrastructure is set up for malicious purposes. Therefore, state B in this case will be held the due diligence responsibility for allowing the specific infrastructure used by the group from state A to harm state C. But as a matter of fact, the infrastructure in state B might be originally for peaceful purposes, but infiltrated by hackers to launch such attacks. Here we come again to the same problem. So a state must have actual knowledge to the harm to be responsible for applying due diligence to prevent transboundary operations. The actual knowledge would be established if the victim state could prove that the territorial state had information or detected that a cyber attack was being launched within its territory. I know it might be confusing, but that's how it is. How could a victim state prove that another state have knowledge in this case, which is also hard, but that would be extremely difficult in practice. However, in reference to the Corfu Channel case, Tallinn manual experts asserted that even if actual knowledge is difficult to demonstrate the legal obligation to exercise due diligence is not affected. So when the governmental infrastructure, rather than private ones, is being compromised, constructive knowledge would be more readily assumed. Also, it's something could be arguable, but it's a point to start from. So it depends on the critical infrastructure. What is it? Is it governmental? Is it private? So all can be, again, depending on the case itself. Also, we all heard that hybrid warfare blurs the distinction between civilians and combatants, or between civilian objects and military objectives. This is very critical. This is also not new. With the new technology, it's more complicated. Why? Especially, for example, when we're talking about dual use infrastructure, which is basically most of the cyber infrastructures are for that. So we recommend that states must take all measures not to treat this infrastructure as military objectives due to the risk it imposes on civilians, especially when the lack of data and information is unclear. With cyber, there is so many problems so far going on. For example, now the debate of one of the things I've read recently is for Mr. Dr. Schmidt, when he's talking about how we treat data. Is it data an object, data of civilians? Does an attack on civilian data is an attack, actually? Because especially when we look at the possibility that it might be cyber attacks against on medical data, which could indirectly cause physical damages and casualties. So there are so many discussions with regards which should be agreed on. Why then the distinction is essential? That is due to the gap between Common Article 2 and Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions. For those who know international humanitarian law, they're definitely familiar with those two articles, but it's especially related to also one of the problems is the protection of prisoners of war, because we know that classification of the conflict also has impact on the rights and duties of the parties to it. So for example, in non-international armed conflict, detained fighter or unlawful combatant will be prosecuted under domestic laws, while combatant in international armed conflict will be considered prisoner of war. So with higher level of protection, of course. What would be strange is the treatment of fighters and combatants in coexisting conflict. So such as that in Ukraine, so where the rights and responsibilities of those participating in the conflict varies. The reason why we call for closing the gap by applying certain rules of international armed conflict to non-international armed conflict, because I believe that hybrid adversaries play on this gap somehow. Definitely, again, I remind you at the beginning that we're not in legal vacuum because IHRL plays a role and others in this case. So just to continue that, so the reason why we call for closing the gap by applying certain rules of international armed conflict to non-international armed conflict, rather than establishing new types of war with the new rules that might complicate. For example, there are so many recommendations of creating what's so-called non-international armed conflict or new types of war. So there are so many debates about this. Of course, it's not for us who can decide, as states shape the international law through treaties and practice, and closing the gap has never been yet favored by states, as it threatens their sovereignty and their supremacy over non-state actors in their territory. Though there are so many promises through customary international humanitarian law, for instance, that have proved certain developments in this area. To conclude, it is certainly a topic that actually really requires hours of presentation, but would like to end up by saying that hybrid warfare is a challenge, not new, but evolving, especially that future conflicts will be more relying on technology and non-state actors. Hybrid warfare is not in a legal vacuum, again, and applicable laws are capable of addressing it once certain changes and gap bridging will be agreed on, which will not allow hybrid adversaries to manipulate the existing legal regime. And finally, this needs, of course, as I started with my introduction, needs cooperation in all fields, nationally and internationally. And one of the good things is this conference, so thank you for that, based on the belief that no one is independent from humanity, but our survival is always based on the actions of the others. So thank you. That brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you again. And I'm really happy to see that we're discussing this today and looking forward to try answering all your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Reedy. You have provided a wonderful insight onto the subject, especially with the relevance of international law. So the president of Center of Pakistan International Relations, Ms. Amna Malik, she just posted a question in the chat. She said that as hybrid warfare is revolutionized, intelligence affairs are also, they're changing with the technologies. So how international law is applicable to maintain the sovereignty of states and how human security should not be compromised?
Okay, can you hear me now? Yeah, so and I see that there is an additional one, which is how new legal order will be implemented in the future. Thank you so much for the question.
Yeah, Mr. Reedy.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All good, right? Yeah,
so you're totally audible. Go on.
Okay, perfect. So as I said in the presentation, that cyber is definitely something new. So when we look at how it changed the intelligence affairs and how it's used through different means, why I mentioned that there is no legal vacuum, because whenever we try to create some what's so-called, for example, the due diligence or the control over the cyber infrastructure in states, this comes with costs, which is also human rights and privacy of data and people who are using this, because cyber is definitely a dual use by military and by civilian sectors. So in order to do this, there should be a huge work in the international community and at the national level that would help the state itself, first of all, not to be targeted by cyber attacks from the territory of states, let me say, failed state or others that can use this. At the same time, they have to work on building resilience in their national sectors. We've seen this in Estonia, we've seen this in Latvia, we've seen this in Lithuania. Working on cybersecurity is in its peak. So they are always working on making this sector very very secure, very capable of facing any new challenges. At the same time, it won't affect the rights and the human rights of the people or the users of this this sector. So from how a new legal order will be implemented in the future, it's definitely one of the hardest questions, because cyberspace has never been actually so far legally defined, or what is, for example, cyber warfare or any other. It's more related to how you look at it from as using attacks against computer systems or others, but legally how to use it or how to create a legal order with it in the future would be definitely a thing that states and governments will work on that. I hope I answered what exactly was meant in this question.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much for sharing your shared insight. I'm very much looking forward to collaborate with you in the future. You can also share your writings for the publication as a special report or research paper, or just know that we can publish it from the platform of Copper. Thank you very much for your time. Now I would like to move further. Dr. Masood, are you with us? Dr. Masood Khatib? Yeah, never mind. So
yes,
moving on.
Yes. Okay. Yes, Abbas.
How are you? I want to see your picture. Welcome on board. I would like to introduce Dr. Masood Khatib. He's a lecturer of politics and international relations in the IIUI Pakistan. He got his doctoral degree in international relations from Islamic Islamabad, with a focus on Indian military strategic thinking and its impacts on the Pakistan. He has served in the Japanese embassy as a political advisor, and he possessed more than 10 years of research and training experience in the field of international relations, strategic studies, and nuclear deterrence in the South Asia. So today, Dr. Masood will be talking about the hybrid warfare and challenges and responses for the Pakistan. Over to you, sir. The stage is yours now.
Thank you very much, Copier, and I'm glad to hear all the learned and august participants and dignitaries. The topic, let me share the slides first, and then we can discuss on. Okay. I'm going to talk about Indian hybrid warfare strategy and challenges for Pakistan, and how Pakistan is tackling these issues, and what are the impacts of Indian hybrid warfare strategies of India against Pakistan. So hybrid warfare, as we many speakers have discussed, that the hybrid warfare is not a new phenomena. It is centuries old phenomena, and many empires and countries, they have been using it. In our context, in subcontinent, um, let me give a reference of Mauryan Empire, and during that empire, Chanakya Kautilya, who wrote Arthashastra, and a well-known, you can say, book which focuses on war and diplomacy. During that period, during Chandragupta Maurya, India, the Chandragupta Maurya was able to establish the biggest ever Hindu empire in subcontinent, and it was because of Chanakya Kautilya's advices and his work, which he did for his king. I have extracted a few things from his book Arthashastra, which talks about four things: Sam, Dam, Dand, Bhed, and more focus is on the exploiting the secrets. Bhed means that you try to exploit the weaknesses of the enemy through secret operations. And let me further explain in his definition of war. In Arthashastra, he talks about three types of war: and open war, secret war, and undeclared war. In open war, he talks about that openly, outrightly attack your enemy and just decide the win or defeat. So in our context, 1965 war and 1971 war were the open wars. Then he talks about secret war, in which he talks about the sudden attack, and you take the enemy by surprise. And normally these attacks are limited attacks. In our context, we can take examples of surgical strike, or India's conventional war strategies like cold start and others. But when we talk about hybrid warfare, we get reference of hybrid warfare from this Arthashastra, which was written in 300 BC, the undeclared war. And undeclared war is quite relevant to hybrid warfare strategy of modern times, in which you carry out secret operations, use of spies, exploit the religious vulnerabilities of the enemy. Sometimes you use carrot and stick policy, and sometimes you carry out direct and indirect attacks. So in this whole debate, we come to a conclusion that hybrid warfare in our scenario is not a new thing. It has been there since ages. But when we talk about in modern times between India and Pakistan, so after since 1947, we are up against each other, and the hybrid warfare we carried out against each other since 1947. Even today, if you look at India and Pakistan's border and their military deployments against each other, so you'll find that most of Pakistani military security forces, they are deployed on the Indian border, and there most of the troops are deployed against Pakistan. So we are up against each other in this domain. So according to the given literature on India and Pakistan, we can come to a definition of hybrid warfare in our context, that it is the state and non-state actors which you use against your enemy, flexible and fluid adversary. Sometimes you carry out offensive diplomacy, media campaign, propaganda, fake news, proxy wars. Of course, both countries have been involved against each other. Engineered social movements. In Pakistan, for example, they were sponsored by the Indians since ages. Cyber attacks. Both countries are also, there at low intensity level, not at the level the Chinese or the Americans are involved. Then terrorism and insurgencies, which are, there. Indeed, the Indians have been supporting these insurgencies in Pakistan, and Pakistan is also doing the same in India, for example. And of course, covert operations. So in all this, definition, you can see all these things are there in South Asian context against Pakistan, for example. So hybrid warfare, as I told you, In Pakistani context, it is not new phenomena. The excellent, you can say, execution of hybrid warfare was in 1971 in East Pakistan, when India, supported an insurgency there and trained about 150,000 militants against Pakistan. And ultimately, Pakistan was dismembered in 1971. So there were many cases when the Indian agents were, deployed inside Pakistani army, Pakistani, other civil institutions, and all these militants, they were actually Indian agents, and they were captured in Pakistan, and they spent almost decades in Pakistani jails. This is also one kind of hybrid warfare which was there against Pakistan. But a new kind of renewed hybrid warfare started after 2008, after the Mumbai attacks in 2008 in India. And after that, the Indians, they came to realize that it is unwise to attack Pakistan openly because of the nuclear factor. And conventional war is also not possible because of the Pakistan's conventional capabilities, which are quite good as compared to the Indians. So they resort to secret operations, and the first step was the establishment of a secret unit in the Indian Army in 2008. And after that, they carried out many covert operations inside Pakistan, and some of the main operations were, you can say, Operation Rehabur was in the Indian occupied Kashmir, and then Operation Seven Sisters was against the Naxalite movement, but Operation Deep Strike was against Pakistan. And the idea was to kill and capture the core leadership of LET, and then which is a local militant group, you can say, and then buy the loyalties of the Kashmiri leaders and others. So main idea was Operation Deep Strike was to carry out operations against LET, which India considered as an enemy, and they were successful in one operation in which they killed Khalid Bashir, who was the security chief of Hafiz Saeed, who was the leader of LET. After that, India also carried out operation. Many operations were secret. You can say covert operations were there, and like for example, Mehran base of Pakistan was attacked. GHQ was attacked. Karachi airport, and many other key military installations of Pakistan were attacked. Why I'm giving the reference of Mehran base? Apparently, it was It was an attack by TTP and the Chechen militants. But as an analyst, you can analyze that militants all the way coming from FATA and entering the Mehran base in Karachi, which is about 1,600 kilometers away, and directly you go to a plane which is PC-3 Orion aircraft, which has maritime significance, and maritime significance is only against India. So automatically you will understand in the coming slides also that this was orchestrated by the Indians. Under same technical service division, India also deployed Kulbhushan Yadav, and the purpose of this particular highly, you can say, trained operative, he was senior commander of the Indian Navy, and he was deployed in Chabahar. And the idea was to carry out sabotage CPAC of Pakistan, which is a mega project between Pakistan and China. Number two, to create subversion in Karachi, which is financial hub of Pakistan. Number three, to incite violence and insurgency in Balochistan, which is facing problems. And the main idea was to undermine Pakistan's collaboration with China. And he carried out operations successfully in Balochistan, and he was later on captured in 2016. And after his confession, he accepted all these allegations. So this was the first step which India did under the hybrid warfare strategy. The second was Ajit Doval, who is the national security advisor of India right now. And after assuming the office, he carried out, you can say, defensive offense. Applied defensive offense doctrine against Pakistan, and the idea was to capitalize on the socio-economic deprivation or vulnerabilities of Pakistan in Pakistani KPK, in Pakistani tribal areas, in Pakistani Balochistan region. So the idea was to just manipulate things there and try to create subversion. And they were successful in doing that because they sabotaged Pakistan's internal security. And they capitalize on the political vulnerabilities of Pakistan. For example, MQM and PTM type of organizations, they got support of India from Afghanistan. And India also, carried out, they declared that they are going to, internationally isolate Pakistan, which they tried. For example, they boycotted SAARC, and they tried to, regionally isolate Pakistan. Secondly, they also tried to, internationally isolate Pakistan through defaming Pakistan and trying to malign Pakistan. And they carried out, offensive maneuvering, diplomatic maneuvering, but so this was part of their hybrid warfare strategy. And of course, the most important engagement was, their proxy war through Afghanistan. Since after 9/11, after coming to Afghanistan, they created, serious subversions in Pakistan. They funded the local militants. They provided them, intelligence input. They, trained them. So ultimately unleashed TTP, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, local militants against Pakistan. But Pakistan carried out, effective military operations in which Pakistan, captured many militants related to TTP, for example, and they accepted that yes, the Indians, they have been, supporting them, they have been funding these people. Like for example, the senior commanders were captured by Pakistan, and some of them surrendered, in which they, accepted that Indians, they had been, creating problems for Pakistan. Not only this, U.S. Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, he also, declared in one of his testimony that India, they have been financing problems for Pakistan from Afghanistan. So the cost was great. Pakistan paid a huge price of the Indian hybrid warfare strategy. Now, let me share that Pakistan and India had, they fought 4 wars. And collectively, we have not lost more than 15,000 people in last 74 years in these wars. But in the hybrid warfare strategy of India, since 2001 to date, Pakistan have lost more than 80,000 casualties and 7,000 soldiers were martyred. And the economic losses were more than $200 billion. So this is the cost which Pakistan faced, in the hybrid warfare strategy of India. So, but Pakistan also tried to counter this, and how Pakistan did it. Pakistan carried out major military operations to bring peace and stability in Pakistani, troubled areas like Balochistan and FATA, tribal areas of Pakistan. And we put a lot of effort in which Pakistan, achieved great success. This was one such step which Pakistan took. Secondly, Pakistan also carried out massive reconstruction and development in tribal areas of Pakistan, because socioeconomic deprivation was one of the reasons that they manipulated the local population. And other than that, Pakistan also carried out Operation Raddul Fasad, which was focused on the urban centers of Pakistan. For example, major cities. Militants, after when they were defeated in tribal areas of Pakistan, so they moved to urban cities and major cities of Pakistan. So automatically, Pakistan carried out a huge effort against these militant sleeper cells, and there were more than 17,000 intelligence-based operations, and it was a collective operation by all intelligence agencies of Pakistan, and it was a great effort. So ultimately, Pakistan carried out huge effort against militants, and economic stability was recovered, and overall security situation in Pakistan improved. Pakistan's global image also improved. If you compare Pakistan's military operations and the security situation in 2003 and 2018, you will understand that Pakistan's efforts were great, and automatically Pakistan brought stability in Pakistan. So hybrid warfare, ladies and gentlemen, it is and between India and Pakistan, definitely it is a great challenge for Pakistan. And how Pakistan can overcome this, let me conclude this on these few points. That Pakistan must improve its overall intelligence, you can say counterintelligence, operations in Balochistan, in FATA, in other areas, just to counter the Indian intelligence agencies in these areas who are operating. Secondly, Pakistan will also need the regional and global diplomatic maneuvering to counter offensive diplomacy and diplomatic isolation by the Indians. That is also needed, and that's why Pakistan is cultivating good ties with the Saudis, and Saudis are ready to invest a lot of money in Pakistan. Pakistan is also improving ties with Iran and not taking side between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan is playing a role as a mediator. Thirdly, Pakistan carried out effective, you can say, played a role as a facilitator in the Afghan peace talks and brought Taliban on the board. Since 2015, Pakistan played a very important role in the Afghan negotiations, and you have seen in recent times that Pakistan, because of Pakistan's efforts and help, the global community was, able to bring peace and stability in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is moving towards a settlement. Then, of course, socioeconomic deprivation in areas like FATA and Balochistan is one of the reasons where the local population, or you can say some of the militant groups, are operating, and they are getting funds and support from the Indians. So you need to carry out a massive socioeconomic development in these areas. Reconstruction and development is required. You have to provide education in these areas, so these people will never indulge in any anti-state activities against Pakistan. Counter narrative is very important. The militants, they are using sometimes they are using the Islam as a for example, as a you can say as a tool to manipulate the locals. Most of the suicide bombers by TTP, they were manipulated by using applying the wrong you can say application of Quranic you can say surahs and other ayats. So what you have to do is you have to counter this narrative with and ulamas, like for example the religious elite, they can do this, and you have to interpret Quran and Sunnah in the right interpretation and in the right context. So we have to counter this, and this ideology should be countered through this way. And last but not least, effective response to India's subconventional, conventional, and nuclear strategies. How you can do it? You can come up with effective and tangible responses, and Pakistan military is capable of doing all these things. They are doing it at all levels. At nuclear level, Pakistan is a credible nuclear weapon state, and Pakistan have got all sorts of warheads to counter at the top level. Then at the conventional level, Pakistan military is also capable enough. They have improved their capabilities with the help of China and other countries. Now, conventional war is also not possible in our region because of the nuclear factor, and of course because of the conventional deterrence by Pakistan. And at subconventional level, which we take as surgical strikes and all that, Pakistan has proved recently in 2019 that Pakistan is capable enough to carry out counter surgical strikes in India. So the Indian hybrid warfare strategy is mix of capabilities. Sometimes they come up directly, sometimes they they use their capabilities indirectly, sometimes they carry out proxy war, sometimes they carry out you can say manipulate things in Pakistan. They try to capitalize on the socio-economic vulnerabilities of Pakistan. So Pakistan has to come up with an effective response with all these capabilities, and Pakistan is capable of doing all these things. But let's see how this region see a development in the future. So things are right now there is a kind of you can say stability between India and Pakistan when it comes to the countering the hybrid warfare strategy. But in future, let's see how it unfolds. Thank you very much. If you got any question, you can ask now, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Masood, for sharing a comprehensive presentation on this. As you have shared that after 2008, the conflict, the India tried to keep the conflict under the nuclear threshold, and they didn't opt for a conventional war. They used the false flag operations such as 2008 and Mumbai attacks. Afterwards, you have mentioned the Jeep Dual doctrine. All of these things, I think they comprehensively cover the hybrid threats faced by Pakistan from its eastern neighbor. So thank you very much for your speech. I would like to ask the panelists if they have any question. Ms. Amna Malik, the President of Center of Pakistan International Relations, is with us now. Ma'am, welcome on board.
Thank you very much. If anybody has any question, I welcome to all the speakers, worthy speakers. Thank you very much for joining us today. So if anybody has any question to Dr. Masood, then I'll move on.
I think you can move, ma'am. No problem.
Okay. Thank you very much. Today, this topic is very important, and this is the part of the series of activities we have already done. Center of Pakistan and International Relations believe in working on cyber security, then national security and human security for a long period of time. And today, this webinar on the changing dynamics of conflict, war, and national security is one of the very important subject of the series of the activities we are doing. We had an international conference on AI implication in national security last year in 2019 and 2020. And after that, we developed the Center of Emerging Technology and Center of Artificial Intelligence to counter and give policy recommendations to the National Security Division and other government departments that how they should realize the importance of implication of this emerging technology in national security. So these hybrid threat challenges, our worthy speaker also mentioned, has a strong impact on national and human security, including the political, economic, and social security. And today, there were many important speakers who discussed that what would be the implication of international law when the national security is threatened. And then they also discussed, like we shared experiences of how hybrid warfare revolutionized the intelligence warfare. So I think this is the right time to work on these things. Where you must share our cybersecurity recommendations, on which we had series of seminars, and then we published a complete comprehensive report, keeping in mind the case study of Pakistan, and also we studied other countries' cybersecurity policies as well. Dr. Khattak, I just joined you at the end, but you rightly mentioned that we are in the age of fifth and sixth generation warfare. So this is the time that we have to develop the counter narrative. Pakistan is misinterpreted in the world, and you rightly mentioned that this socio-economic deprivation makes our youth vulnerable to all these threats. So I believe that our youth can play also an important role, and they can, through social media, they can present the positive image of Pakistan. And this is the time we need to see that how the international world is working on facing the challenges of hybrid warfare, and how hybrid warfare is intermixing with these biological warfares and economic warfares, because now there is a complete new world order coming up, especially after post-COVID. So I think this is the right time to discuss these issues, and I believe our print, electronic media, and digital media also need to work on cyber ethics, because deep fake news is also another area where we worked, and we believe that our government should take some effective steps, because how our hostile neighbor use through diplomatic missions, through proxy wars, through the civil society, they try to develop a negative image of Pakistan. But although Pakistan is a balanced, peaceful country, so this hybrid warfare challenges our government is keeping in mind. Our defense forces are working on it, and like a civil society, we need to develop a network to study other countries, case studies, that how they are catering it and how effectively Pakistan face this challenge. Because I believe sometimes artificial intelligence can also play an important role to counter this hybrid warfare, and we need to work on these emerging technologies. So our next session would be on, there will be another international webinar on implication of emerging technologies in national security policy, and we are going to present a final recommendation paper. We would like to welcome all of you to join us, and finally, I would like to thank you, all of you, to be the part of today's webinar. This is a very important topic, and let's have a peaceful world in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Amna Malik. So moving on towards our final speaker, without further ado, I would like to call Ofer Friedman, the Director of Operations and Lecturer at the King's College London. Previously, he served as the head of Non-Lethal Weapons Project, and since 2013, he is associated with academia, initially at the University of Reading and now at the King's College London. So, sir, the stage is yours now. Apologies for the delay, and looking forward to hear from you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for invitation and for introduction. It's my great pleasure to speak here. But before I begin my presentation, a very honest disclaimer: I'm not an enthusiast of hybrid warfare. I wrote a few books and multiple articles where trying to put things right. It's not that I trying to deny the activities conducted by those or others actors. I think hybrid warfare as a term it's just a buzzword that means absolutely nothing, and actually more confuses us than helps to understand the complex environment in which we require to operate. And I will try to kind of show you my point. I'm not trying to force you to think differently. We're living in a free society. Everyone is free to think whatever they want. But I would like to argue the opposite here and try and reduce a little bit this enthusiasm into this not so new, as most of you already pointed, term and concept, which I will even argue it's not new, it's completely useless and more confusing than helping. So before I start, let me share my screen with you. Yep. So before we start, we need to know, and before we start any discussion, we need to have our terminology right. Because anyone who deals with defining things or analyzing things, we need to treat terms and names that we use with great respect. Because any term represents the comprehensive meaning of the phenomena that it describes. In other words, if you name something and call something correctly, it means that you understand it correctly. And if you name it and call it incorrectly, it means that you don't understand it. Now, when it comes to terminology concerning wars, to put it clear, war is not a warfare. And although sometimes we use it interchangeably, in fact, war is not a warfare and it's not a conflict. All these free terms, free words, which were invented and defined for purpose, define completely three different things. Where war, it's a condition or a state in international relations where two political actors involved in a violent dispute to achieve their political goals, whatever you're going for a definition of Clausewitz or anybody else. But war implies violence. Conflict, on the other hand, does not necessarily imply violence. We can have two different political actors, then compete one with another without resorting to violent means. In other words, any war is a conflict, but not every conflict is a war. And then we have warfare. Warfare, it's neither war nor conflict. It's just a set of tools used in a war. So in a war, we will have cyber warfare. We will have land warfare, air warfare, naval warfare, information warfare, and all other kinds of warfares. But all of these make sense in the context of war. So without war, all these activities are not warfares. Now, another one is that not every war is an armed conflict. And we had previously our legal expert here, not every war is an armed conflict, because although war has no definition in international law, armed conflict has one. And for example, it implies that armed conflict can happen only between states, which we all know not necessarily the case. So, and war can be waged between state and non-state actor, where legally armed conflict cannot. And not every conflict is a war, as it was stated before. Because as far as two political actors can be in the state of conflict, but as far as they haven't resolved to violence, it's not a war. It's a conflict of a certain degree. And obviously not every conflict is an armed conflict. And therefore, laws of armed conflict do not apply on every conflict. To try and apply wars of armed conflict on cyber activities which are not part of war or not part of conflict, we are getting onto a very slippery slope of misunderstanding and confusing ourselves what we're trying to do and what the nature of confrontation is about. More importantly, not everything which is called a war is a war. Cold War, for that sense, was not a war. It was a period of very hostile international relations conducted between communist bloc and democratic bloc in the West. And it was not a war, thankfully enough. There were proxy wars where there were clearly defined actors which used violence one to another against another, whether we're talking about Vietnam, Afghanistan, Middle East, and so on. All these was wars. But Cold War was not a war, and this is without going into other usages of the term of war, war on drugs, or war on crime, or whatever other linguistic application of term war is applied for its certain connotations and attributes when we call something a war. But not everything which is called a war is a war. And not everything which is called a war is armed conflict. And not everything which is called a war is a conflict whatsoever. So we need to treat terminology that we use very, very carefully. Otherwise, we not only misinterpret the situation, but also we will confuse ourselves, which will lead us to conducting mistakes, and most importantly, prevent us to countermeasuring whatever our adversaries do. Now let's go to hybrid warfare for a moment. Now generally, and I spent last few years analyzing different definitions and different discourses, there are three general families of understandings of hybrid warfare. The first one, which was originally mentioned by our American colleague, is hybrid warfare, which was originally invented by Frank Hoffman in the United States. And it implies a combination of different modes of warfare, regular and irregular, including all their tactics and terrorist activities, violence and criminal disorder. So this was one which was created by Hoffman in 2007 conceptualization, where he was conceptualizing a battlefield. And we will come back to this. Now NATO, as a more strategic organization, came up in 2010, and more specifically after the Crimean crisis and annexation of Crimea and the Russian activities in eastern Ukraine, into this kind of all-embracing concept of hybrid warfare, which is basically a combination of military and non-military tools. It combines everything in one huge basket, which is diplomatic and physical and economic and information, everything in one basket, which is conducted by an adversary, according to NATO, is hybrid warfare. And the last family, it's originated in Russia as a reply, as a response to once they started to be accused by NATO in conducting this hybrid warfare, which they call Hybridная война, I even give to this a different term because it's different. And according to them, it's an amplification of any possible social, political, economic, and ideological divisions in adversary society. It does not involve military whatsoever. Okay, it does not involve usage of military. It's mainly non-military tools of subversion and other information activities to undermine your adversaries. So while we're talking about hybrid warfare, we need to specify what hybrid warfare we're talking about. And without this specification, well, we don't know what we're talking about. And this is one of the problems of hybrid warfare. We will get to others. Sometimes I'm giving talks to an audience of military professionals, whether it's NATO or more national armies like the UK or the United States. And it's very interesting exercise. I ask my audiences, what do you define as hybrid warfare? And we will get as many definitions as people in the audience. So in this kind of vague understanding of what we're talking about, how we can even use this term, and we will get to other explanations of complete uselessness of this term in a moment. But let's come back to these three general families. Generally, they can be placed on this kind of spectrum of different tools from non-military, economic, information, diplomatic, financial, and others, and to completely military tools, deploying military to achieve political goals. So if we're trying to place them, we will see that in fact each one of them occupies different territory on this spectrum. The original hybrid warfare sits very much on the military spectrum. This warfare speaks about tactical operational environment. It's how the future battlefield will look like. It has nothing to do with economics. It has nothing to do with subversion. It has nothing to do with information. It's when I deploy my division against an enemy in a future war, how the battlefield will look like, what kind of enemy my division will meet. This is the original one. And Russian hybridная война, Russian conceptualization, it's very much on the opposite side of this spectrum. Meaning, okay, so what kind of activities or what kind of actions of force we can use against our adversary without resorting to military? Okay? And the hybrid warfare, as most common usage of it, as was popularized and politicized by NATO, is basically everything. It's basically everything which we don't like, which is conducted by our adversary. It's hybrid warfare. If adversary manipulates with prices of gas, it's hybrid warfare. If an adversary conducts a cyber attack, it's hybrid warfare. If adversaries, I don't know, foreign minister says something which we don't like, it's a hybrid warfare. Okay. Now, so if we're trying to, okay, so what actually these hybrid warfares coming to describe? And in fact, it's quite simple. So the American one, the Hoffman's ones, it simply describes a tactical operational environment on the battlefield. As I said, it's about a new environment. His lessons, Hoffman's lessons, when he was writing it, was based on the experience of the Second Lebanon War. And then on different other conflicts conducted in the latest history, in the modern history. He started like more or less from the 70s, trying to understand how enemies, specifically enemies of the American military, would combine regular and irregular means and methods on the same battle space against American military. When we think about Russian hybrid warfare, or how Russians define it, it's simple: hostile international relations. It's not a war, it's not a conflict. When two states or two political actors are involved in a competition, sometimes these competitions can become hostile without escalating to military confrontation. And history is full of all these non-military means used in hostile international relations against perceived or real adversaries. French supported the Americans during the American Revolution. Before that, French was trying to undermine the British Crown by supporting Scottish barons in their struggle against the British Crown, which was we're going back to Middle Ages, and this is we can go even further. But we all know the Bolshevik were basically supported by the Germans, CIA with the revolution in Iran, British with the Arab revolt. History is full of all these subversive, undermining, non-military means to achieve political goals. So why we use hybrid warfare? Why we confuse ourselves with it? And then finally to this hybrid warfare as defined by NATO. So basically, as I said, it applies everything which an adversary does: economic, law, legal, military, energy, diplomacy, information, political, whatever you put, they put in one big basket. So basically, we're talking about all available means of power used by an adversary against us, which is hybrid warfare according to NATO. Well, apparently we have a very good term to that. It's called grand strategy, which is concerned by use of state by all available means. So the question here is, which I have an answer to this, but it's not today. But in fact, hybrid warfare, its adversary's grand strategy. For example, the presentation, which was by speaker before me, by Dr. Hatak, it was a brilliant presentation. How Indian grand strategy manifests itself and how Delhi tries to achieve its political goals in the region. True. So why do we confuse ourselves with all this hybridity and completely meaningless and useless terms which confuse us all? Yes, this was a brilliant presentation and analysis of India's grand strategy. How India uses all available means of power to achieve its political goals against Pakistan. And more importantly, any war is hybrid by very nature of war. To say hybrid war is to say wet water. Any war, once you're in a state of war, and we already discussed war is not a conflict. So once military confrontation and violence erupts, everything which can be used to bite out of the enemy will be employed. I don't remember two states waging a war, but simultaneously managing very good economic relations and tourism and other activities. No, once it's a war, it will be accompanied by economic warfare, cyber warfare, and all other warfares. Because war has always been hybrid. By the way, any international relations, whether hostile or not, also hybrid, by the very nature of international relations. Because we are trying to kind of divided in scholarly environment. Okay, economic relations, political relations, diplomatic, but in fact they're all interconnected. Economy is used to achieve political goals and vice versa. And any grand strategy, by its very definition of grand strategy, it's also hybrid. So actually to use this adjective, it's only misleading because it creates something out of nothing, confusing us and failing us to understand to use the terminology and the terms and concepts which we're all familiar with, to understand the problem, and more importantly, to countermeasure it. For example, the cyber problem discussed by Ala Aldieri before. So first of all, cyber warfare can be conducted, as any warfare, only during wars. Russia cannot, so far, conduct cyber warfare against Estonia, Lithuania, or any other European country, because they're not in the state of war. I'm not saying that Russia does not conduct hostile activities. It does, but it's not a war. It's not a warfare, and it's not. Therefore, it's not a subject to international law of conflict. Only if it will be conducted within the framework of armed conflict, only then it will be subject to international law of conflict. Now, cyber hostile activities, which are conducted as a part of international relations, hostile or not, they are subject to domestic or, as rightly was pointed out, so far non-existent international laws. To try to bring cyber hostile activities, which are conducted as a part of hostile international relations under the jurisdiction of international law of armed conflict, it's to not understand the relationship between state and the place of war, warfare, and international relations. So I think I will end here, trying to kind of evoke conversation about the usefulness of this term. We have already plenty different terms which more confuse us and then clarify the picture. So maybe if we go back to old familiar terminology where we can establish common language between scholars, practitioners, and other experts to speak at the same level and not confuse us with all this nonsense. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ofer Friedman. I'm very much intrigued by your stance, your standing on the topic. It was quite different and quite unique. I've never ever heard or read someone saying this. And I also find that there's a common ground, as you said, that there should be a conceptual clarity. There should not be the overlapping of the words and terminologies, which more confuse us rather than solving the problem. Thank you very much for joining us today and sharing this. So with this, we are now at the end of our today's webinar. As Mr. Ofer Friedman said, that we need conceptual clarity, and war is itself hybrid. As Dr. Khattak said, that there is much more apart from the military preparations we can do to overcome these threats. As Mr. Aridi said, that we need due diligence, and as Brian Elstead said, that we need to adopt multiple narratives and accommodate them and show inclusivity. So thank you all for joining us today, for attending this session. There were more than 500 participants at the Facebook and Zoom collectively who have reached this webinar. This calls for an urgent action, whether it's the confidence building, whether it's awareness of the concept. We all have to, contribute and involve ourselves in these to overcome these threats, which are not only a threat to the national security, but to human and international security and order as well. Thank you for giving your precious time for us. I will conclude with this, that stay blessed, and thank you, and Pakistan Zindabad. Thank you very much.
Thank you.